I'm Billy Hollowell, and welcome to Newsmakers, a show where we bring you interviews with pastors, actors, entertainers, and other notable news figures. On today's show, we're going to be getting into some fascinating topics, but before we do, if you are not subscribing to Newsmakers, make sure you head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe right now. Give us a rating. We love 5-star reviews. This is a show where you're going to dive deep into important issues with amazing people. With no further ado, here is today's show. On today's Newsmakers, the situation in India is incredibly disturbing. Today, Joel Veldkamp from Christian Solidarity International joins us to explain what persecution looks like in India, why it matters, and why we must pay attention. With no further ado, here is Joel Veldkamp. Joel, a lot to break down today, as usual. Today we're talking about India, and when we talk about persecution, and you know this better than anyone, many people have no concept, especially in the West, of what is happening in countries around the world, specifically as it pertains to Christian persecution. So let's just start with the general situation right now in India when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, India is an interesting case. It's the biggest country in the world. It has well over 1 billion people living there. 80% of the country is Hindu, and there's a small Christian minority of about 2% or so. And India has a long tradition of democracy, of the rule of law. But in the last 10 years or so, things have been getting really systematically worse for Christians and other religious minorities in India. India has a government led by a party called the BJP, which has its roots in Hindu nationalism. And this party has really changed the atmosphere in the country, both in a legal sense and just in a social sense, to become more hostile towards Christians. And as a result, in 2024, according to an advanced copy of a report that we've been able to see at CSI, it was a record year for attacks on Christians in India.
What do you think is, obviously over the last 10 years, you mentioned some of the shifts. What do you think is driving that? Because it is alarming when you start to see those patterns develop to the level that they have there.
Yeah, I think in some ways India is coming into its own as a great power. It has a well-developing economy. It's becoming stronger on the international stage, and it's trying to find its own identity. But another important aspect is that the party that's in power has been able to use kind of religious identity as a weapon against its opponents to stay in power. So it encourages its supporters to vote for it because they say they are the true Hindu party. They are the party that will protect India's Hindu identity. And of course, that kind of rhetoric requires an enemy. And unfortunately, India's very small Christian population becomes that enemy in the eyes of many of the followers of this political party.
So you have this situation where you have a merging of, religion and government to the point of this is what you need to preserve and save what we have. And, let's look at these people over here and blame them. Let's talk about what that looks like. What is daily life like for Christians? And I know this is a complicated question because persecution comes in different layers and levels depending on where people are, but help us understand what that day-to-day life might look like for a believer.
Sure. The problems really come from two sources, the police and then society. In just society in general, there's a lot more hostility towards Christians these days. So it's not uncommon for people to be harassed, for people to be attacked in their homes, even for Christian villages to be burned. There have been a few cases of Christians who have been murdered by their neighbors or by Hindu militants for refusing to convert to Hinduism. And the problem is that when Christians go to the police and try to ask them for help, the report finds that the police don't take these complaints seriously. In only about a third of the cases did the police actually file reports on the complaints that they received from Christians who were under attack. The other thing is that in a lot of states in India, they've passed what they call anti-conversion laws, which make it illegal to convert someone away from Hinduism using force or allurement. Well, what is allurement? That could be almost anything. So in practice, police use that to arrest and prosecute Christians for holding church services or for sharing Bibles or for even just talking about their religion with other people. So about 100 Christians are in jail today in India under these anti-conversion laws.
Wow. Okay. So we have people being imprisoned, obviously unfairly. And, again, in the context for the West and especially America, the First Amendment, the ability to worship, the ability to speak, the ability to say things that maybe people don't like. And that, in this case, would include trying to help somebody understand the Christian faith, proselytizing maybe, that could be punishable because of these laws is pretty shocking, I think, to a lot of people. Is there a particular story, or maybe there's more than one, that specifically stands out to you in the work that you do at CSI that you've just been sort of horrified by, or that has stood out as an example of what this can look like in practice?
I mean, really, the most extreme case of what's happening in India right now is in a state called Manipur in the far east. And this is a place where about 2 years ago, the region exploded into anti Christian violence. There was a conflict over land rights, about who had what right to own what land in the territory, and it turned into a religious conflict. So, in about a few weeks, around 40,000 Christians were forced to flee their homes. Most of them now live in refugee camps, where the rates of deaths from cancer and kidney failure and other treatable illnesses have really skyrocketed because they simply have no access to medicine or to basic supplies. And that violence against this specific group of Christians called the Kuki-Zo people continues until this day. And just last November, there was a mother of three, a Christian woman from this indigenous group called the Kuki-Zo, who was attacked by Hindu militants, raped, and burned alive. And that set off another round of violence between the groups. Scores of people were killed, more people were displaced. And the government really seems kind of completely absent from this situation. The humanitarian aid is really weak. There's been very little effort to restore order. And the governor of this region just resigned a few days ago after tapes were released showing that he was actually implicated in some of the violence against the Christians in this area. So that's by far the most extreme problem that is in India today.
I mean, it's horrific. What you just described is absolutely horrific. People, I mean, rape, being burned alive. I mean, these are things that in 2025, and I say this to you all the time, every year, I say 2024, 2025, how could this be happening anywhere in the world? And yet here we are. And we know that by all accounts and numbers, Christian persecution has actually worsened around the world and is in a state right now that is unimaginable. Now, let's talk about why this is an important week, because you actually have the Prime Minister of India going to DC and visiting with President Donald Trump. Talk about that meeting and why you view that as an important interaction, and maybe what Trump could even do to help this situation.
Yeah, it's a very important week for U.S.-Indian relations. The Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, is one of the first foreign leaders to visit Trump since his inauguration in January. And when Trump was president between 2017 and 2021, these two men had a very good relationship. They called each other dear friends, they even campaigned for each other. Trump went to India to a campaign rally for Modi. Modi came to Texas for a campaign rally for Trump. So there is a relationship here to work with, even though there are lots of issues between India and the U.S. that have to be discussed, like immigration, like tariffs. But Trump has a relationship with this prime minister, and Trump also promised to be a president who would care for persecuted Christians in the world and try to protect them from persecution. So he doesn't have to flip over the table. He doesn't have to make threats. He doesn't have to harm the relationship. But while he's in the room with the prime minister, I think the president should just say to him, look, we know this is happening in India. We know you're probably not happy about it. We encourage you to really do something about it. And that would be an excellent starting point. But the most important thing is for the American government to show that this is of interest to them, that this will affect U.S.-Indian relations going forward.
Because that, and you and I have talked many times in different countries, we've talked about Nigeria, it is the pressure that is put on these countries, negative PR when these horrible things like you just described happen, pressure, whether that comes from government, media. Talk a little bit about that, because I think people don't really understand, well, what do you do? This isn't our country. We're not living there. Talk about how Trump and the US and even the media can help move the needle towards a positive direction.
I think it's important for us to appreciate how big the influence of the US actually is, right? It's not that the US controls everything or can do everything or should try to do everything, of course. But the US does have a lot of influence. And on issues like this, sometimes it doesn't take very much to move the needle in the right direction for persecuted Christians or for other people who are suffering from oppression. You mentioned Nigeria before. Nigeria's president also visited Trump in the White House. And on that occasion, President Trump said to him, Mr. President, when are you going to stop killing Christians? You probably didn't hear about that. Most people in the US probably didn't hear about that. People in Nigeria heard about that. That was several weeks of media cycles in Nigeria because people were astonished that the American president was interested in this subject. So I think it takes wisdom and it takes diplomacy, but President Trump can make a big impact for persecuted Christians in India and in other countries if he wants to. And I think his supporters who care about persecuted Christians should call him to that.
Absolutely. Well, I so appreciate you taking the time breaking this down. Where can people go to find out more about CSI and the incredible work that you do?
You can go to www.csi-usa.org. We do our best to keep you informed. We're active in 15 different countries around the world, bringing aid to persecuted Christians, and we'd be honored for any support or engagement that you can give.
Well, I so appreciate you taking the time as usual. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Billy.
That's all for today's Newsmakers. I'm Billy Hollowell. Make sure you head on over and rate this show on your favorite podcast platform. Let your friends and family know to listen as well. We have new episodes Monday through Friday on your favorite podcast platforms. You can also watch the Newsmakers TV show on the CBN News channel. That show airs once a week with 3 incredible interviews with newsmakers. Be sure to head on over and watch that, and also head over for more interviews to the CBN News YouTube channel and cbnnews.com. I'll see you again very soon for another Newsmakers.